it's hard to get started in this business young. It is. So if I was a young person looking at coming into the independent space right out of college, if I didn't have like a parent or a sibling in the business that was already running it, that would be tough. That'd be so difficult versus you go to a big company where they have teams of people like designated to help you be successful. And that is so valuable. So I think it is so important that those companies are around because they do so much to bring in fresh, young, new people to serve clients continuously. And you can do great at those companies.
Welcome, Model FAs. David DeSalle here, president of Model FA and your host of the Model FA podcast. And I'm really excited for our guest today, James Jurica. And James was actually proactive and reached out to me directly about being on the show. So if anyone listening has a good story to share or a good experience they want to highlight or know of someone that has a good story or experience, feel free to shoot me an email at david@modelfa.com. Always looking for new and unique and interesting folks to chat with and deliver value to you. So if you or someone you know fits that mold, let me know, and I'm happy to have a conversation to see if it is a fit. But James started in the business at 21 years old after graduating college, very similar to me. So I'm excited to kind of compare notes, so to speak, as to the beginning of our careers together today. He started at New York Life. I started at Northwestern, so very similar setup. And he was in personal production at New York Life for 3 years and then went into a management position for an additional 3 years. Again, very similar to my background. So excited for this. Ultimately, he did get curious about the independent space and ultimately ended up leaving New York Life to pursue a career within the RIA space. He now works as the director of advisor development for Wealth Watch Advisors, which is the larger RIA that he's a part of. And within that setup, he is the founder and lead financial advisor of Taggart Wealth Management. So with that, James, I'm excited for you to join. I appreciate you being proactive and reaching out. Excited for the conversation. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on, and very excited to be here.
Awesome. So talk to me about, I don't know if your story is similar to mine in that, I had a career fair or career portal, I should say, uploaded my resume. I got a call from Northwestern. And I actually started off in their internship program to begin with. And I've shared kind of that story a handful of times, but that's kind of how it got started. How did you get started in financial services in general? Like, is it something that you went to school for? Is it something that you kind of stumbled across? Like, what was the precipice of your career path?
Yeah, so I actually got my bachelor's degree in psychology. And so going to the career fairs my senior year, and really it seemed like the only places that were going to look to hire me were car dealerships. And I was willing to take that job because I just wanted something to graduate with and knew that I had a job lined up. But then I ended up uploading my resume to Monster, and I got an email one night from somebody at New York Life saying, "Hey, found your resume, think you'd be a good fit for this business. Do you want to come in for an interview?" And they said I could be a financial advisor. And I just thought that sounds way better than selling cars. So absolutely, I want to come in. And I had never looked into the financial services industry. But then after that, I applied to a whole bunch of different places. I applied to Northwestern, went in and talked to those folks for a little bit. But New York Life did a good job of, sort of selling me on how it would work and what they would allow me to do and all the great things I can do there, and eventually ended up there right after graduating.
Awesome. And I think it's interesting too, and I'm very thankful for the types of companies like Northwestern and New York Life. And I think folks in the independent space, including myself now, we can pick on them a lot. There's a lot of faults that they have, but there's also a lot of really good things that they do. And I think one of those things is taking kids, honestly, 21 years old, and taking them from, like, I had a boat detailing and repair business, and I happened to major in finance, but minored in psychology, so I had a similar-ish focus as you. Or they take kids, like you, who are going into the car industry and expose us to financial services, which I think is just really cool. And there's plenty of folks where it's not a fit, but there's plenty of folks that it totally changes their life. So I think we got to give credit where credit's due to, the New York Lifes and Northwesterns of the world for exposing folks to the career that otherwise wouldn't have been exposed to this industry. So I guess one of my questions to kick off is, what was that transition like? Going from college, a brief stint in the car space to ultimately becoming a financial advisor, presumably not knowing a ton. What were the first few months days even? Like, what were those like?
Yeah, so I'm very fortunate that the office that I worked in San Antonio is huge on training. I think New York Life's big on that in general, but especially that San Antonio office is obsessive with it, which is great. So I remember getting started and it was tough. And it was tough, especially because, and the way it worked with us is it felt like I didn't even have a job almost. They were like, you work for New York Life, but I didn't have to go to the office. I didn't really have anybody checking in on me. There wasn't a whole lot of accountability. And so I think a big reason a lot of people end up struggling in the beginning with that is the lack of self accountability, the lack of time management. And that was tough getting started, especially because the main people I knew were broke 20 somethings.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to build a financial business, a financial practice, working with people that don't make a lot of money, or, they're still in school, so they're really not making much. Or when they're out, they are not focused at all on trying to save some money for their future or get life insurance or anything like that. So it was definitely tough. I'm fortunate I had some phenomenal mentors that taught me early on how to prospect into better markets, how to get in front of people much older than me. And I definitely had that guiding path that was a huge help.
Yeah, I think there's a fine line between having autonomy,
Mm-hmm.
right? To the point where people can say, like you said, I got too much freedom and too much leeway here. And if left to my own devices, I'm not going to work as hard as I could work. And then you have the other side of the coin, which is, oh my goodness, these people are micromanaging me and watching my every move and making me track my activity. And if it were me, I would lean more towards the latter scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Because especially at that age, like, we need structure.
Yeah.
But there's like a fine line. And I think when you have the appropriate mentors that can communicate their intentions for staying on top of you as it relates to accountability, it can really be instrumental in people's success. I'm curious, so you spent 3 years in personal production. You then quickly went over to management. What was that transition like? Were you still producing at that point, but had a focus on management, or were you totally out of a producing role and just, working towards corralling your team?
Yeah. So at New York Life, you're either in a production role or you're in a management role. Or their train of thought is you're going to do one thing, you're going to do it well. Otherwise, somebody's going to get the short end of the stick, either your clients or the people you're supposed to be managing and helping. So I get that. I really understand that philosophy and it makes a lot of sense. So when I moved out of personal production, I could service my clients a little bit, but I was, 95, 99% of my time and effort was focused on the management side. And I did a lot of training. That was the bulk of the role, was sales development manager. So actually helping new people as they come in, get their businesses started, getting them off the ground, showing them how to do things, going on meetings with them, helping them build their books of business. So that was the bulk of that. And that was huge because the exposure in terms of quantity of different people I would meet and different number of cases to work on a monthly basis was so much more than I ever could have done on my own.
Yeah, it gives you exposure to a bunch of different scenarios, because I'm sure just like advisors who have been in the business for 20 years, they're still learning, but you got to speed up your learning curve with just being able to have conversations with all different types of personalities and whatnot. What did you notice in terms of themes with the advisors that you were leading? What were some of the things you noticed as it relates to their struggles that were fairly common? And what were some of the ideas or the tips and tricks that you shared with them to ultimately overcome those struggles?
Yeah, so I think the big one, it's going to come down to name flow. So just having enough people to talk to. It's like if you view yourself as a business, that is your inventory, is having enough individuals to talk to. And so a lot of the times people just they thought they were working a lot more than they were, and they were doing things that weren't really revenue generating. They weren't doing things that were, high priority that would actually move the needle. They would spend time doing online classes. They thought they were making lots of phone calls, and maybe they were making 10, 15,
Yeah.
in a day. And so a lot of the times that's what it came down to. And looking back, I had the same issues. I struggled really hard for probably 18 months getting started. It was a tough, tough start. And when I look back, I still remember my very first interview at New York Life, and the individual interviewing me, I'm still close with him to this day, but he said, I'll teach you how to work 20 hours a week and make $100,000 a year. And I was like, that sounds like the greatest thing in the world. I'm 21. Like, this sounds amazing. I don't even know what the job is, and I want it so bad.
Yeah.
And I nailed the 20 hours a week thing when I started. I nailed that, but the income was definitely not there. And so a lot of the times it was just I would waste so much time. That's kind of what it came down to, was actually not having the structures in place and not focusing on the activities that were actually going to drive my business forward. I could focus on all sorts of other things, but none of those things were really advancing my business or helping me grow or helping me develop more clientele.
And it's interesting because it kind of brings us back to one of our first points about, the dichotomy between autonomy and too much structure. And I'm willing to bet that if your mentor stayed on top of you even more earlier on, that
Mm-hmm.
you would have gotten off to a better start than kind of the beating your head against the wall for the first 18 months or so. And people just need to know that you care. And then you can kind of really lean into them and hold them
Mm-hmm.
accountable in a very tough way.
Yeah.
But that tough love is pretty beneficial. And I feel like there's a really good career path within these types of companies like New York Life and Northwestern, where it teaches you the grit and the tenacity and the sales acumen and all that stuff at the very beginning, and really does a good job of turning you into a rainmaker. And then there's other setups to where you're working as a planner and you're making a salary, and eventually you get into a business development role, maybe, or maybe you take over that advisor's practice like in the RIA model. So the way that you and I grew up in the business doesn't need to be how everyone grows up in the business, but I think for the right people it's a good setup. But sometimes potentially the RIA space ultimately makes more sense long term. Again, not for everybody, but for you it did. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious to know, what was kind of the precipice of you starting to explore the RIA space? Because I know for me, for the longest time, until I really got into consulting and I left Northwestern, I couldn't even tell you what the RIA space was. I just had no context. I was, Northwestern did a good job of like putting up walls and, not really giving you exposure to other aspects of the industry. So what was that like initial thing that got you to be interested in the independent space?
Yeah, so I was fortunate that New York Life also they paid for all my designations.
Mm.
So I eventually ended up getting my CFP. And after that, I was thinking, what else is out there? I've only been with one company, only been in one office, and it was like family, that was so close to everybody. But I just felt like, especially from a planning perspective, especially from what we could do for clients, I just thought like there's got to be more. And I had enough more advanced education to get exposure on that end to a lot of things out there. And I just thought there had to be more. And so then I started looking around, and I didn't find anything else out there that really got me excited or felt like that's worth the change, because again, I felt like I was at the greatest place ever. And then I stopped looking, but then one more independent company reached out to me and said, "Hey, I want you to come in for an interview." I agreed. They said, "This is what we're going to offer." It was all these great things. And long story short, ended up moving there for a short time. But what I didn't realize was I was going broker dealer to broker dealer. And I
Mm.
think you see that a lot in the business is you see people jumping broker dealer to broker dealer to broker dealer, and you're taking your old problems with you to a new place. And very rarely does that change much. go into a new place because you're still carrying the same old bad problems or the same struggles or the same limitations in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So went there, wasn't what I was hoping it would be. And instead of wasting time, got out sooner than later and eventually found the RIA space, which sort of opened my eyes to, wow, there is so much more. I was focused on, had to get my Series 7. I got that and had to get all those other licenses. But then I didn't realize there's a lot out there that don't require all these extra licenses that I'd already taken. But just finding it and then really seeing all the unique ways that you can work with clients and all the unique solutions and planning opportunities available on the RIA space was extremely eye-opening. And I knew like this is going to be where I spend the rest of my career is working in that space. And since being in it and getting exposure to even more and more and more, that's kind of become even more ingrained that this is like, yes, this is what I was looking for after all.
I think it's important to note too that although I think you and I can be partial towards the independent space, having been exposed to it, you alluded to this, but I feel like oftentimes people will seek to make a change from one company to the next, thinking that that change is going to solve all their problems. And that's usually not the case because this is an activity-based and sales-based business to a degree. And if you're not good at those things at one company, it's not going to magically appear in the other company. And there's a number of folks that I know at Northwestern that, two examples. One, they do true financial planning. They're not just hucking insurance and, that's the Swiss Army knife for everything and that's all you need. They actually do great planning, and their compensation structure, when maximized through the various aspects of planning, is pretty tough to beat. They do fantastic. And I'm sure New York Life is similar. And there's also some people that are kind of struggling at Northwestern. I say the same thing to them all the time when they start talking about the independent space. I'm like, well, listen, if you're not succeeding in your current setup now, you're probably going to repeat that if you go somewhere else. Sometimes truly the grass is greener, but other times you just need to water the grass that you're on right now and like actually work hard. I say that because as partial as we can be to the independent space, New York Life, Northwestern, MassMutual, Guardian, all those types of companies, you can still be very successful there. There just may come a point in time where you decide to explore elsewhere and expose yourself to what else is out there. If nothing, more than just doing some competitive research so that if it comes up in the prospect scenario, you know how to speak to it. So you go to the independent space. What was that transition like? And specifically, I want you to answer it as it relates to, like, one of the biggest things I was worried about was these are my friends and family at Northwestern, and I'm leaving to go into consulting. And I felt like I was losing part of my family. And it was interesting, the people that you realize are actually your friends and the people that you realize were just kind of coworkers and you don't hear from them as often. But what was that process like emotionally, leaving your friends and family behind, so to speak, with the folks that you worked with at New York Life and going in a different direction?
That was extremely difficult because they took me from psychology major 21-year-old to what I became, like
Mm-hmm.
CFP in management. Like, it's hard to put into words how important New York Life was to me in terms of like career development and the opportunities they got me exposure to. And I was so close with so many of them. And I'm fortunate that I still talk to so many of them literally on an everyday basis,
Oh, that's cool.
where I still talk to them. I'm on a group text with some of them. I see them out and about when I go out places. We'll run into each other and get lunch with them. I mean, so close still. And so that was really good. But it was a very difficult decision. It's hard to get started in this business young. It is. So if I was a young person looking at coming into the independent space right out of college, if I didn't have like a parent or a sibling in the business that was already running it, that would be tough. That'd be so difficult versus you go to a big company where they have teams of people like designated to help you be successful. And that is so valuable. So I think it is so important that those companies are around because they do so much to bring in fresh, young, new people to serve clients continuously. And you can do great at those companies.
Yeah, I agree. So now you're running your own RIA linked up with the larger sort of parent RIA and have the ability to have your own DBA and branding and all that type of stuff. In your development role specifically for Wealth Watch advisors, what do you notice in terms of similarities or differences in that sort of development role when you compare it to New York Life? Is it easier? Is it harder? Do you notice different skill sets with the folks that you're leading? Like, help me understand your experience in that regard.
Yeah, so it is a little different because I knew at New York Life, I was getting people that had no experience, didn't know anything about the business, didn't know anything about the industry, and I was getting them from the day they started for the first 3 years. I had them. And so it's super easy at that point to mold them into what you are trying to create there, basically, like
Hmm.
that type of advisor that fits within the company versus on the independent side you don't really know what you're getting. They've come from all different backgrounds. Some of them come from a bank background. Some of them come from an investment heavy background. Some come from an insurance heavy background. And so that wide variety definitely plays a role in how you try and coach and help and train on those aspects. I'd say the one thing, and it's so true, and it's something like the managing partner of the San Antonios would harp on all day, every single day, was nobody ever does good marketing to the names that they've captured. And nobody keeps and markets to a database of names over time. And so therefore everybody's constantly having to prospect.
Mm.
And he's 1,000,000% right that if you just focus on building a database and marketing to your database and you work on that hard for 5 years, you might never need a prospect ever again, like not real prospecting. You're asking for referrals. You have your COIs, then you have thousands of names in a database that you've been able to cultivate over years, and that can provide absolutely all the name flow you need to run an incredible practice for years and years to come. But nobody ever does it.
I 100% agree. And it made me think, I'm just looking now. So, in one, two, three episodes from now. So, we just had our 101st episode release with Greg Bishop, and we're recording this on August 11th. So, this won't be released for a bit, but 3 weeks from August 11th. And I guess when you're listening to this, you're going to have to go back in time to episode 104 with Robert Sophia, the CEO of Snappy Kraken. I had him on and I read his book called Blend Out, and it harps on that point. I would get that and I would have all your advisors read that. It's phenomenal. And what I like about it is it harps on that same point that you made, which is, hey, you work so hard to get this name, phone number, and email address. Like, don't just call them, and have them say no and then move on to the next one. Have a way to where you can build a relationship with them at scale, stay relevant, nurture them, add value to them. And over time, I mean, I hear this all the time in working with, some of our, or not some, but all of our advisor clients. Like, everyone's got that story of, oh yeah, I called this guy 4 years ago and, he kind of blew me off. And then all of a sudden he popped back up and said, hey, I just sold my business for $5 million or $10 million. I'd love to get together and chat. And it's like, imagine if you didn't stay relevant to that person in that scenario. So there's so many different ways through email, through social media, through events that you can stay in touch with these folks and build a relationship. And ultimately, to your point, you get client referrals, COI referrals, and then, people finally, raise their hand after getting on your email list. So I 100% agree. That's a massive opportunity. And I think that you'll really enjoy that book based on that scenario.
Yeah.
So, before we kind of start to wrap up here, we've talked about where you've been. We've talked about what you're doing. I'm curious to know where you're headed. So you're in the development role. You're running your own financial planning business right now. Like, what does the future hold for you? What are you looking to build and the impact that you're looking to have?
Yeah. So I do want to build up my practice much more. I want to bring on more advisors. I made a commitment from the start to be a CFP only firm. And it's
Mm.
just to try and stand out. I've seen those firms before and they build great businesses. They're all very successful. And it's just the way to try and differentiate yourself because I think more and more advisors become commoditized and people will fee shop over 5, 10 basis points. But doing what you can to differentiate yourself as a group of advisors, I think is huge. So building that. And then I also think how many clients can I really see versus how many people can I impact by building, growing, and developing a team that can go out and see 10x, 20x the amount of people I can see on a day-to-day basis. And so being able to have that impact, I think, is the best way for me to try and promote good financial planning, making sure people are being properly taken care of. And so just trying to build that for the future, it's the main focus. And I think it's going to be the best way for me to not only build my business and build something to pass on one day, but also just have the biggest impact in the community at large.
Now, how do you plan to do that specifically? Do you plan to go kind of the Northwestern New York life way and kind of get them while they're young, type of thing and develop them? Or are you looking for, in an ideal world, folks who are already CFPs that would join both? What would you prefer? Like, how do you plan on kind of accomplishing that in that regard?
I would say both, but looking more towards the experience side. And just because when I look at it, I know that with all that I do, I don't have time to properly develop and train people from the ground up every single day. Trying to build a team of scale would be extremely difficult just because I know the resources that were poured into me. And it was literally teams of people doing that to
Yeah.
develop, one person. And they worked with groups, but it was their whole job. And so I think working with others that have already been in the business is going to make that vision a lot easier to accomplish. And it's just a more efficient way.
Yeah. And we'll give you an opportunity to kind of plug where folks can find you if they find themselves sitting there with the CFP. But as we know, this business can be lonely, when you're not a part of a team. So sometimes people are successful. They just want to latch on with someone else because it's more fun.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll give you an opportunity to plug yourself if folks want to reach out. But before we do so, I do want to transition. So if this is your first episode that you're listening to, one of the things that I ask all of our guests is what one of their favorite books is. And part of the reason why I do that selfishly is I like to read and I want to hear what, people are reading. But selflessly, it's a way to distill a reading list for folks. And we have great guests on the podcast. And I'd like to know what great people are reading. And the book that you chose to talk about, James, that's had an impact on you, which I love this book. It's called The Go-Giver. And this was actually a recommendation from a good friend of mine. If he's listening, Kurt Mueller, you had sent this my way back. But why'd you pick The Go-Giver? What's the impact that it's had on you, your life, your business? Tell us about it.
This was my second business book I ever read or got exposed to. The first one was obviously Think and Grow Rich.
Yep.
As it should be.
I got 2 copies of Think and Grow Rich. One to read, I got one to listen to on audiobook, and then one to give away when someone says they haven't read it. I'm like, oh, here you go.
Yeah. So that one came first, but then The Go-Giver, you get a lot out of the title, right? About giving and about providing value. I know you're a big Gary Vee fan. Mm-hmm. And so it sort of resonates off of that same message of give value, give value, give value, be authentic, and that'll help you grow. And it was kind of just so important to me to hear that young in the business. And they wrote the whole series of like The Go-Giver Leader and The Go-Giver Sells More. And they got with David Bach and wrote The Latte Factor and just simple stories that really carry a lot of weight and have a lot of nuggets in there, but very simple to understand. But you kind of get attached to the characters in a way. Mm-hmm. And so it just stuck with me ever since. I'm all about books. I got 200 something in my Audible library. So it's just like, this one has always stuck out to me as everybody should read it.
I haven't really got into fiction style books, but that's the extent of my exposure. The fiction books is business parables and stories and whatnot. And it's a good sort of, it's still a good use of time because you're learning something, but it's a good way to kind of take a break from like the heaviness from some of like the actual business or marketing style books. So I love that book. Well, James, if I'm an advisor and there's some things that you had shared that I'd love to learn more about, or if I'm an advisor and I find myself in a similar situation where I'm at a broker dealer, regardless of who it is, and I'm exploring the independent space, what's the best way to get in contact with you to pick your brain and see what it would look like to potentially become a part of your team as well?
Absolutely. So you can go to wealthwatchadvisors.com. That's where you can check out the RIA on a big scale and then connect with me personally. LinkedIn is definitely the best place. Just James Jurica on LinkedIn. Be happy to sit down, talk, Zoom or in person, if you're local, and see if I can do anything to help you in any way possible.
Awesome. And you said San Antonio a couple times. Is that still where you're at?
Still in San Antonio. Yep.
Cool. Well, I'm always curious how many of our listeners actually reach out to the guests that are on the show. I think that it's a really cool sign to hear, or it's a good sign when you are proactive about it. And I think what you'll find is, people are open to it. Like we have a guest that's scheduled out in November, and you'll read about him. His name's David, and he's the financial chef, is what he calls himself. And I'll save the insight for you when you read it. But I read about him in the book. And I just cold called him. I was like, hey, I read about you in this book. I think you'd be a great guest. And he was more than open to chat, more than open to schedule. So if you're listening to this, you're on the fence, just pick up the phone or, go to the website, reach out to James directly, have a conversation. He's offering it up. So definitely take him up on that. But James, I appreciate you being proactive. I appreciate the time today on the podcast, sharing your story, and excited to welcome each other to the independent space.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Take care.